Man, I'm happy to introduce to you today, Dr. Tony Fauci.
Thank you, Jack, for that kind introduction. It is truly a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with you this afternoon to tell you this story. As you see on this first slide, 30 years of HIV/AIDS, a personal journey. It's an unusual talk for me because I'm not going to chronicle all the science that's been done or mention everyone that I came into contact with. Well, what I want to share with you is a personal story of how this all happened, the setting in which it took place, and the reflections I've had that when you're living through historical events, which some of us, and I think everybody in this room has with HIV/AIDS, you rarely appreciate that it's history because you're just working really hard to do your job. It's only when you reflect back on what has happened do you realize that you're dealing with a historic event. So we in the biomedical research and healthcare profession should realize, as many of us, if not all of us, do, that the last 30 years in the history of global health and domestic health is truly historic. Everyone has their own personal history. Patients of mine, some of who I see in the audience, others who've been involved. This is my personal history. And I want to direct it also specifically, though, to everyone in the audience, to the younger people who may have been either very young or not even born at the time that this happened, to point out to you how things in your career and in the experiences you have are things that shape what you do and over which you have very, very little power. It happens and it puts you in circumstances that you have to react to. So with that as a very brief introduction, I'm going to start off before the 30 years to show you how I happened to get into this and how, under similar circumstances, likely anybody else in this room could have done the same thing. So it is with a degree of sober humility that I tell you this story. So I went to Cornell Medical School in New York City, and this is a picture of my internship and residency staff. I was trained in internal medicine. I had a burning desire to study the interface between infectious diseases and the human immune system, which was not particularly well studied at the time because most of immunology was in mouse immunology. I came to the National Institutes of Health in the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In this building as a clinical associate, I was extremely fortunate to have been in a laboratory where I had a mentor who was one of the most unselfish people that I ever met, Shelley Wolf. And what Dr. Wolf did was put me on a project that was a rather unusual, somewhat bold project that I'm going to tell you about in just a second. I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to stay in fundamental basic research, but as many of us who come to the NIH, I was bitten by the bug, as it were. I went back to the New York hospital as chief resident in medicine for a year after 3 years of an combined infectious diseases and immunology fellowship, with the guarantee by Dr. Wolf that I could come back and study a group of patients that he had been following for a considerable period of time. So I was very lucky. I came back and started studying a group of patients with a disease called Wegener's granulomatosis and a variety of other vasculitides like polyarteritis nodosa. Now, being in this building had some very important advantages because I was on the 11th floor, and on the 13th floor was Vince DeVita, Paul Carbone, and a bunch of other people who were using a drug called cyclophosphamide at very high doses to treat Hodgkin's disease, for which they found the cure, and acute lymphoblastic leukemia, for which they found the cure. So I was familiar with a couple of things. I was familiar with the infections people get when they were immunosuppressed, And I was also familiar with the fact that maybe we could give low-dose cyclophosphamide and suppress the immune system enough to essentially cure, if you want to use that word, but treat effectively a formerly fatal disease like Wegener's. And it worked. It worked prematurely to my stage in my career because as a very young person at the time, I was 27 years old, I shouldn't have been as successful as I was. But it was due to a mentor who put me on a great project. And I did that for about 10 years, was really quite happy and successful in what I was doing. But the purpose of my training was to study the interface between infections and the immune system. And then one day, as I was sitting at my desk on the 11th floor of this building, an MMWR landed on my desk from June 5th of 1981, describing 5 individuals, young men, curiously all gay, all otherwise healthy, who presented in Los Angeles with a bizarre type of pneumonia called pneumocystis pneumonia, which I was really quite familiar with because I had seen it on the NCI wards on people who were being treated with combined chemotherapy for their cancers. So I knew there was something immunologically very wrong with these individuals, but I didn't have a clue. I put it aside, thinking it was a curiosity and that it was going to go away, when 1 month later, on the 4th of July of 1981, another MMWR landed on my desk, now reporting 26 men, again, curiously, all gay, not only from Los Angeles, but from New York City and San Francisco, presenting not only with pneumocystis pneumonia, but also with Kaposi sarcoma. And as I've often said, that was literally the first time in my medical career that I actually got goose pimples, because I knew there was something very wrong and very new here. So I did something which seemed extraordinary then because my mentors thought I was crazy. I decided to completely change the direction of my career and walk away a bit and turf to other people the studies that I was doing on autoimmune type diseases and begin to study these unusual patients. And this is a picture of my laboratory in 1981. Now, several fellows, and I think the fellows in the group can appreciate this, had come to my lab to study the immunoregulation of the human immune response, particularly the B-cell response, which I had been studying for the previous 10 to 12 years. But I decided we were going to change, and I was looking for somebody who might be interested. In that group was a young man named Cliff Lane, who actually was one of the brightest, if not the brightest person I've ever had in the laboratory, who wanted to study B cells. And I said, Cliff, how would you like to study this unusual group of patients? And in typical Cliff fashion, he said, why not? Let's do it. So that was the beginning of a team of people that we put together to try and start admitting these patients that Jack spoke about. The only trouble is we knew they were going to be very ill because back then they only presented with advanced disease. So I showed you the Cornell pictures because it's a connection at New York Hospital. The head of the intensive care unit was Joe Perillo, who was a student when I was chief resident. And I told him I wanted to admit these patients, and he said, I have enough problems with taking care of the NCI patients who have all these infections. You're going to have to get me some help. At that time, just finishing his infectious diseases fellowship in New York City, again at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, was the person who reported the first cases of HIV, which was not known as HIV, from New York City, Henry Mazur. He was just out of his fellowship and was a young attending at the New York Hospital. I had known Henry because he too was a fourth-year student when I was chief resident. So I convinced him to come down and be the deputy chief of the intensive care unit, which I'm not so sure that's exactly what he wanted to do, but he came down and did it. And that formed the first team of people who were studying HIV. Subsequently, Phil Pizzo and others studied pediatrics. Sam Broder, Bob Yarchewin and others began studying the treatment after the drug was, after the virus was discovered. But this was the first team that was studying these men who were coming in with advanced disease. Now, I told you my peers thought I was crazy, and they kept on asking, why are you doing this? This is a curiosity that's going to go away. So I want to point something out to you that in December of 1981, which was published in June of 1982, I wrote a commentary in the Annals of Internal Medicine, and I came out on a limb. The editors didn't really like the idea of my saying it, but it was a commentary, so I did. And I said, as shown on the slide, remember, this was essentially restricted just to gay men at the time. Because we do not know the cause of this syndrome, any assumption that it will remain restricted to a particular segment of our society is truly an assumption without scientific basis. No sooner had that hit the press than we started to see a cascade of reports, first from the MMWR and then in the classic journals. OIs in Haitians, well, it wasn't just Haitians, it was the situation Haitians were in. That used to be a category of a risk group, which is preposterous. Also, people with hemophilia who were receiving blood products, transfusion associated, infants born of infected mothers, immunodeficiency among sexual partners, female sexual partners. And so the era of HIV/AIDS began. This is a picture of me on rounds examining a patient who was admitted, again, with this unusual disease. It was an extraordinary time. I refer to it as the very dark years of my medical career, because having been used to treating people with formerly fatal diseases like the vasculitides, and then coming in and seeing essentially all of the patients dying was a very, very sobering experience for me. Here's another picture on rounds, and this is Doc Bowen, who was HHS secretary under Ronald Reagan, who came to visit the NIH, not necessarily to see HIV-infected individuals, but just on a visit. And I began to plant in his mind the idea that the president might want to get a little bit involved in that. I told you those years were dark years. We had great nurses at the time. One in particular was very, very competent to the point where she became a leader in training how to take care of HIV-infected individuals. This is a story from the Washington Post in 1985 of nurse clinician Chris Grady, who had been taking care of so many of our patients. I was so impressed with her that I wanted to make sure she stayed with the team. And from that came our three daughters, and I throw this up for a number of reasons. Everybody likes to show a picture of their family, but these are three young women who have never known a world without HIV/AIDS. And as Jack said, one of the driving forces of all of us is to make sure that they do see a world without HIV/AIDS. So I told you that I steered Cliff away from his major goal of studying B cells. We didn't have the virus, we didn't know what caused it, so we did some, at the time, rather unsophisticated phenomenological research. We described the abnormalities in B cells. Little did we know that that was the first paper to describe aberrant immune activation in HIV disease, which we know now in 2011 is the main driving force of HIV replication. We went on and described the first specific soluble antigen recognition defect in collaboration with Tom Wallman and Warner Green, who was a fellow at the time in Tom's lab. Again, Cliff made this his major project. Now, that's the last I'm going to tell you about any of the scientific work that we've done over the last 25, 30 years on HIV pathogenesis, because there are some other things I want to tell you that I think would even be of more interest to you. In 1984, in a very ambivalent way, I was offered and accepted the job as the director of NIAID, and I did that because it became clear to me that as much as I enjoyed the bench and the bedside, that I wanted to have a bit more of an impact, not only with HIV/AIDS, but also with other infectious diseases, including the interface between infection and the immune system. So then I put on another hat. I didn't stop seeing patients, and I didn't stop running the laboratory. So I had to put another team together. And here is the core of that team. Jack Weizscarver had gone down to Emory for a while after Dr. Krause left. We brought him back as the deputy of the OAR because I was the head of the OAR. And the person on the right is my very close and dear friend, late friend, Jim Hill, who I appointed as the deputy of NIAID. This was the executive committee, and I show it because there was considerable early on reluctance on the part of classical infectious diseases people to create a special division of AIDS because they thought it would be diverting money away, which I had to overrule that and move ahead with it. So in this group, as you see, was my trusted companion and dear friend, Jim Hill. But also, I hired at the time a special assistant who actually just finished her, again, residency at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, who was interested in getting involved in public health issues. And that person is someone who made out pretty well after she left us, Peggy Hamburg, who went on to become the Commissioner of Health of the City of New York, and then ultimately, currently, the FDA Commissioner. So we had the scientific team going, and we had the administrative team going. I had my first introduction to back-to-back, several times a week, believe it or not, congressional hearings, where I learned a few things that I didn't fully appreciate. When you have an administration that's Democrat and a Congress that's Republican, or a Congress that's Democrat and an administration that's Republican, and there's a conflictual thing going on, they start throwing missiles at you. So I had the very unusual situation of having several, I would say at least between 100 and 200 congressional hearings, which clearly is the world indoor record, but also multiple briefings. And it would be that when the Republicans were in power, Ted Kennedy would just blast me all over the place on C-SPAN in the hearing, and then after throw his arm around me and say, "I love you, Tony, it's nothing personal, this is just strictly business." It was a very interesting time. The other important thing that I never would have imagined in my wildest dreams was the issue of interacting with various presidents, because this was a national and global issue. Now, I told you early on that the first president who was involved then, and who was the president when I was appointed with Ronald Reagan, who got a bad rap because, in fact, he did not mention AIDS until a couple of years into the epidemic. But in credit to him, he really gave me and some of my colleagues from the CDC what we call blanket clearance to not only go out and talk about it, but also to visit the crack houses and to visit the bath houses to get a feel for what was going on there. Things changed quickly when George H.W. Bush was vice president and was thinking about, which he did, running for president. He visited the NIH, said he had heard about this guy Fauci who was seeing patients with HIV, and he wanted a couple of hour run through looking and seeing patients, which really transformed everything for me and for HIV, because he came here, and after he left, this is a picture of him visiting a ward, and that's Sam Broder on the left. You know Sam from the NCI, who was responsible for the development of AZT. And for reasons that had nothing to do with any great quality in me, but just the circumstances, I became very good friends with George H.W. Bush, who continually called me and asked in a very sensitive, inquisitive way about what we can best do for HIV. Here is the president in the solarium on the 11th floor in this building, talking with a large group of HIV-infected individuals. And here he is, I'm sitting next to him, and this is one of our patients, and Mrs. Bush was there. I learned at that point something that I'm going to repeat a few times over the next several minutes. When you're in Washington, really be nice to everybody, because you never know when a person who you think is at a low level is going to turn out to be in an important level. Like this person who was sitting at the end there, who was a staffer in George H.W. Bush's White House, a very powerful behind-the-scenes staffer who I fortunately came to become quite good friends with, among other people that I'm going to mention in a moment. Here is Bill Clinton visiting the NIH. You see Francis here on the side. Francis had just presented the Genome Project issues. I was talking to him about HIV. Things now started to really roll because we had administrations who were interested in us and in our budget. This is a picture that we've shown several times of Harold Varmus here and I in the Oval Office talking about HIV. Now, usually I talk about epidemiology because politicians can't understand it, but Bill Clinton wanted to talk about receptors and CD4 and CCR5, which he actually got pretty well. It was a great visit, but one of the things that came out of the visit is Harold and I were walking out to do a press briefing out into the Rose Garden. He stopped Harold and I and he asked, "What do you guys really need out there?" At which point we said, "We need a cohesive vaccine effort. How about a vaccine center?" This took place in 1997. The president turned to Leon Panetta and said, "Make this happen." This is the fastest building that has ever gone up on this campus for sure. Again, I guess because the president really liked Harold, I'm not sure, but it happened. This is President Clinton dedicating it, and we were fortunate enough to recruit Gary Nabel to be the director. Again, getting back to the theme of be nice to everybody, even first ladies, because Hillary Clinton was more interested in global HIV than anybody else at the time when she was first lady. She went on to become senator, was extremely helpful, and now, as the Secretary of State, is a good friend and appreciates what we're trying to do here in the research endeavor. This is George W. Bush visiting the Vaccine Research Center. I'll get back to this in a moment because this is absolutely critical to what's gone on over the past couple of years. And finally, here is Francis and Secretary Sebelius and I with President Obama, who also has a major interest in what we do. Now, that's part of the history. Let me just now talk a little bit fast forward about where we are, and then I'll, oops, bouncing balls here. Okay. So where are we now, as Jack had mentioned? We have now an extraordinary historic situation. About 70 million people total infected, about 35 million people who have died, 33 million people living with HIV, 2.6 million newly infected each year. In this country, 500,000 deaths, 1 million people infected, 20% of whom don't know they're infected. Why is this critical? It's critical because of those 21%, those are the most of the people, 65% of the new infections are from people who do not know that they are transmitting the infection to someone else. So this is a very important number that has to do with where we're going now. The funding for NIH has been extraordinary. Here's where the funding was at the time when I came in and became director. Right now, we all know about the sadness of the flat budget, but we've spent about $45 billion on HIV research over the last 30 years, including a $3 billion sum each year annually over the last several years. I just did a search last night. So if you plug in HIV, you get 225,658 papers. No, I haven't read every one of them, but I'm trying. So the investment, and the reason I show it to you is that the investment in biomedical research has great dividends. And I know Francis and Harold and other directors before them, Elias, would always point to the investment in biomedical research and what we get. And these are some of the advances in HIV science, everything from discovery of the virus right here, the co-discoverer Bob Gallo right here on this campus, but importantly to treatment. So let's just reflect where we've come with treatment right now, because it is truly an extraordinary historic story. So here we are on rounds in early 1980s, when a patient would come in with a 6 to 8 month median survival. As I mentioned, truly the dark years of my medical career. The darkness lifted a bit in 1987 when the first trial of the drug that Sam Broda helped develop right here in this building, AZT, was used in individuals who had advanced disease. And as you could see, 19 people on placebo died and 1 person on AZT died. That's the first and only placebo-controlled trial done with therapy in HIV for obvious reasons. Importantly, although the cloud lifted, it didn't go away, because we quickly realized that one drug was not enough. And a very long road, we realized we were in it for the long haul, until over a period of years, by fundamental basic and translational research, we were able to identify the targets for antiretrovirals, and now we have more than 30 FDA-approved antiretroviral drugs for HIV, which, and this truly is a breathtaking result, if someone now walks into our clinic who's 20 years old and newly infected with HIV, we can mathematically model that they will live an additional 50 years, which is most extraordinary. Now, I can't even begin to talk about treatment without bringing in the role of activism in HIV science. And I'm going to quickly run through this, because this was, in many respects, a game changer for us. Some of you who may not know this person, his name is Larry Kramer. He is a dear friend but longtime nemesis. He was a, I would say, iconoclastic at best, very theatrical, of course he was. He was nominated for an Academy Award for the screenplay of Women in Love. He wrote an iconic book called Faggots, in which he actually predicted that lifestyle of gay men in the 70s was going to lead to some health catastrophe. It's very interesting that he did that. He also wrote a number of plays, all award-winning. The Normal Heart just reopened on Broadway. And The Destiny of Me, interestingly enough, this is further on after we became friends. He came to the NIH, followed me on rounds, and he spoke about his coming out as a gay man. And in the book, I was his doctor, who he called Tony Della Vita, for Tony of Life. It won an Obie, but I didn't get any of it. So here's a person who really was shaking the cages. And one of the things I think that was so important was that once they got your attention, now remember, I trained like many people here in medicine. I wanted to save lives and be good to people. Larry wanted to get my attention. So in June of 1988, on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle magazine section, he wrote an article, "I Call You Murderers, an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci of the NIAID." And what he was trying to say is that the government was not doing enough, and we were not being flexible enough in our clinical trials process. So he started ACT UP, and he started Gay Men's Health Crisis. So remember, going back to what I said, that President Reagan gave me essentially blanket clearance, so I was in the press a lot. So when people saw federal government, they saw me. So they figured, since there was a lot of things wrong with the federal response, they started demonstrating. They were unsophisticated at the time because they got much better. Here they are saying, "Dr. Fauci, you are killing us." And as you can see, this was during the Reagan administration. They had a picture of me. The only problem is they were demonstrating in front of the FDA. When they finally figured out that I wasn't at the FDA, that I'm actually at the NIH, they said, "Storm the NIH." And notice, let the record show 10 years, $1 billion, one drug. That was AZT. This kind of sounds like some of the constituents these days, Francis, doesn't it? However, this is what the camp, for the young people around who enjoy the geese on campus, do you think the geese would survive this? This was right in front of Building 1 during one of the demonstrations here at the NIH. a die-in in front of the lawn of Building 1. But importantly, and this is probably one of the most important things that I did as an individual, if you get past the theater, if you get past the mohawk haircuts and the goth boots and the multiple earrings, what they had to say was something that was really, really important. And if you listened to them and read what they wrote, it made sense. So one of the best decisions I made is that as the police were getting ready to arrest them all on the NIH campus, which would have been a disaster, I asked the police to bring their 5 leaders, whoever were the claimed leaders, up to my office in Building 31 to discuss how we could form a partnership. And from that meeting came one of the most productive, long-lasting partnership between the activists and we here in the biomedical research community. It was the first, they were stunned. It was the first time anybody would even talk to them, much less want to put them in jail. I also have to mention a great man, Marty Delaney, who was a different kind of an activist. He was trained as a Jesuit priest, an openly gay man, left the seminary, and began being an advocate for treatment. And he and I were engaged in very many discussions, and the point that he was saying is that we've got to change the FDA approach in the following way, and I'll be very brief. And that is, when you have a clinical trial in a new drug, there are all exclusion criteria. So if you don't fall in the right place, the right time, the right weight, or whatever, a drug that was promising, you may not have access to it for years and years. So he and Jim Igo from New York City proposed what's called a parallel track, which means you do the clinical trial and you let the drug be available to people on a parallel track, which would not influence the data that goes into the clinical trial. I was convinced it should work. The FDA, with all due respect to the FDA, were dead set against it. Marty invited me to California to address a town meeting of activists, mostly gay men. And he said, Tony, you got to get out there and go out for parallel track. I said, enough is enough. I started what I've done a couple of times since, that it's better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. So I got up there and I said, what we do is I call this a parallel track approach. In a major shift, long sought by those involved in the fight, the chief of federal research called for a new system. Little did I know that a New York Times reporter was sitting in the audience. The next day it hit the front page of the New York Times, and for the first time I thought I was going to get fired because the FDA was furious. However, I had a friend in the White House named George H.W. Bush who we spoke to and said, this is really the right thing to do. And sure enough, the FDA said, I embrace this wonderfully, and that was the beginning of the parallel track. Now, fast forward a little bit, because this is a very important meeting that took place in South Africa. The activists were demonstrating here in the United States for access to drugs that were not yet proven to be effective. In Africa, in 2000, they were demonstrating for drugs that were shown to be effective, but that they didn't have access to. So they borrowed a page from the American, European activists, mostly ACT UP, and started demonstrating. Why not make drugs available? And here is, in my own mind, probably the thing that I am most privileged to have taken part in, and that is the birth of PEPFAR. In 2002, President George W. Bush sent Tommy Thompson, shown here, and I to Southern Africa on a fact-finding mission to try and determine if there's anything the United States can do for these developing nations with regard to HIV/AIDS. We did it. We went into the villages. Here I am making rounds in 2002 with the most depressing deja vu I ever had. It was 21 years later, and these African physicians were in the same boat that I was in with Henry and Cliff in 1981 and 82. Only they knew there were drugs available. They didn't have it. So I went around, and the real question was, can you actually deliver drugs
on a daily basis to individuals in Africa. So here's me with a 17-year-old young woman in Uganda who was using, with the AIDS Service Organization, a very important organization in Uganda, and using what little money they have to buy drugs, deliver it to villages, and here shown in the villages treating individuals. They were very, very capable of being able to take medicines, despite the fact that some people thought they were not. So I came back to the United States after a couple of weeks in Africa, and then from the spring of 2002, I show this picture of Josh Bolton, getting back to my theme. Be nice to everybody, because Josh was a staffer in George H.W. Bush's administration, and I got to know him when he had very little influence. Only now he was the deputy chief of staff to President Bush. And he got me in to see the president, and we made a proposal of about $500 million to a mother-to-child transmission, which the president loved. I thought that was it. Now we can go back to work. But as I was walking out of the Roosevelt room, the president grabbed me by the arm and Josh by the other arm and said, "Josh, I want you to work with him, and I want to put together a game-changing program that goes well beyond mother-to-child transmission, that is a game changer in Africa that's accountable." So literally from May of 2002 until December, January of 2003, I went back and forth to the White House putting together various models. What's the right countries, how much in treatment, how much in prevention, how much should we do for care? And that is a very unusual situation. It was because of people like Josh Bolton and Gary Edson and Jay Lefkowitz, names of staffers that nobody knows, that we were able to work with the White House. Now, I want to tell you one of the things that is important that you'll never hear about. OMB was furious because they heard that we were putting together a program that was going to be billions of dollars. So they were not amused that I was having access to the inner circle, particularly since Josh said you can't tell anybody about this, no one. So I was in a very difficult position. I was very uncomfortable. I couldn't even tell Tommy Thompson about it. He says, because we may want to launch this. So one day in a somewhat confrontative discussion with OMB, the OMB person came by and said, you know, maybe you just want to get more money for the NIH. So you're just a white guy in a suit. I want to have people in here saying that this program can work, because I was proposing $15 billion. So they said, you have 48 hours to bring somebody down here to testify to the OMB, was Mitch Daniels, that this is workable. So I got on the phone, literally, and they said, but by the way, you can't tell anybody why they're coming here. Just have them come here. So I got on the phone, I called up Paul Farmer in Haiti, I called Eric Gooseby in Rwanda, I called Bill Popp in Haiti, and I called Peter McGenye, who was in Uganda, and say, you got to trust me, you got to come to the United States, but I can't tell you why you come here. So they said, is it about what I think it is? And I said, yeah, I think it is. Why don't you come down? And I was also promised that I wouldn't brief them what they were going to, because they were going to ask them the question, is this worth it? So we made an arrangement that we would meet at a restaurant in Bethesda. And I show this, some of you know, this is on Cordell Avenue. The reason I show you the picture, that this was a secret meeting where I was briefing them to say, yes, we need the money. It just reminded me of the restaurant in which Michael Corleone shot Soloso the Turk and the police captain. It was just exactly the same. So we walked out of that in secrecy, and then the president announced that PEPFAR was real and put in $15 billion over 5 years, prevented 7 million infections, treated 2 million people, and cared for 10 million people. Another story for those in the lab who love it here but don't necessarily like bench work. This was my lab in 2002. I had a brilliant person in the lab, a great clinician, who was never comfortable with bench work but liked policy. He helped me put together the mathematical modeling for this. And when the administration appointed Randy Tobias to be the ambassador, he became the deputy. When Tobias left, that person's name is Mark Dybel, who actually was a fellow in the lab and was the ambassador here being sworn in by Condi Rice, who was Secretary of State at the time. So now PEPFAR, as you know, 3.2 million people receiving antiretrovirals, over 400,000 infants averted with ARV prophylaxis, and 11 million people on care. If you put together PEPFAR, the Global Fund, the Gates Foundation, we now have about 6 million people in low and middle income countries who are receiving therapy. That's the good news. The sobering news that we face, and that I'll close on, is that less than 40 million people, for 40% of the people who are in need of ARV are getting them, and for every person we put on ARV, 2 to 3 people get newly infected with HIV. So the critical issue now is prevention. But I got to tell you one more story before I go on to end with the prevention issues, is that back in the Reagan administration, the Surgeon General was a man named C. Everett Koop. Now, he was nominated for Surgeon General because he was thought to be extremely conservative, because he was a surgeon from Philadelphia. He was a pediatric surgeon, internationally renowned. He did the first separation of the so-called Siamese twins. He came here, and his nomination lingered for 8 months. He was totally aghast. He was here, a respected person. They kept on knocking him around. He didn't feel well. So they said, well, we have this person who's a pretty good internist at the NIH. Why don't you go see him? So I became his doctor. And he was on so many different medications up and down. And I asked him, I'm going to tell you this, so I'm not diverging any secrets. So after working him up, I came to the diagnosis, very, very clear diagnosis, the welcome to Washington stress syndrome. So I became really good friends with him, and I want to show you a picture for those of you in Building 31. This is a picture of, this is my desk, and this is where, I bet you not very many people know the Surgeon General lives on this campus. So in order to get from parking his car, he had to go through Building 31 to his house. So he would frequently stop in my office and say, you know, what is this thing with HIV? I'm really getting very interested in it. And to his great credit, he became fixated on what we needed to do with HIV. So he was asked to put together some pamphlets and things, so he did. He put together the Surgeon General's report and a letter to every person in every household in the country. Now the problem is, when he started talking about things that were a little bit too much for the conservative mind, they had him do it, but they didn't give him any money for it. So he couldn't send out the letter. What they didn't know, with all due respect, those political appointees, there's a thing called an interagency agreement. So he asked me if I would lend him a few $100,000, and he sent it out. Now, it had words like sex, anal sex, oral sex, homosexuality. So when it came out, this was the reaction in the United States of America. If anything comes in the mail from the Surgeon General, don't open it. So let's go with prevention. There are a number of proven strategies that I don't have time to go into with you. The last year and a half have been most extraordinary. Circumcision has now, in the long term, has a 68% efficacy. Topical microbicides work. If you use them, they work even better. So that's absolutely something that we need to pursue. Pre-exposure prophylaxis in gay men works. It works better if people adhere to it. The most striking data came 2 weeks ago that I'm sure many of you read about, that treatment can be used as prevention, because if you treat people early in the course with a high CD4 count, and they're in a discordant relationship with an uninfected partner, not only is it good for the person, but you can actually 96% reduction in the likelihood that they would transmit infection. Vaccines, something you may not know, the first vaccine trial was conducted right here at the NIH by Cliff Lane 24 years ago. It was a protein GP160 subunit. A year and a half ago, we had the first good news of an HIV vaccine, albeit a modest effect, nonetheless a proof of concept. So where we are now and what you're all going to be hearing about over the next year or two is the combination of prevention. We don't have a vaccine yet, but as probably some of you have heard me say in the press recently, we do have already available at our disposal, only needing to be implemented, the wherewithal to really put an end to the HIV epidemic. And in fact, my colleague Greg Focus and I spoke about this in a commentary last year where we were talking about something we never would have even imagined 30 years ago. And that is that we might be able to control and ultimately end the AIDS pandemic. So, in closing, since 1988, when they first established World AIDS Day, I've been asked, either here in this auditorium, many times down at the White House, to make a statement about HIV. And last December 1st of 2010, for the first time, I said something that I hope is going to turn out to be true. And I will end with that quote. And that is, I hope that in the not-too-distant future, World AIDS Day will be a commemoration of something in the past, as opposed to a challenge that we still face today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That was well done. There's still a few minutes. Big surprise to everybody. For those of you who have appointments at 3 o'clock, feel free to move out. Those of you who have burning questions, we have the man to answer. There's nothing to ask.
So there's going to be a reception out there for people who want to chat a bit. I understand that you're...
I didn't know anything about that.
There is. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.